Great to be here. I didn't think I would be able to make it when it first was announced in 2020. I want to thank IIFET Secretariat for enabling me for the award and the selection committee, and thank the Secretariat for making this trip to Vigo possible. It's been a while since I attended an IIFET conference, 18 years in fact. And that was in Tokyo back in 2004. Last but not least, I want to thank and congratulate the organizing committee of IIFET 2022. I've had a lot of communications with Wally and Anna and Lydia and others. It's been very helpful. I don't travel very much these days, and I was a little bit anxious about making this trip. I look forward to seeing several old friends from IIFET, as well as meeting some new young scholars that are joining our field of fisheries economics and trade. You're the future. To join this group, hello. To join this group of previous fellows is a great honor, and one that I never expected. There are some incredible people on that list, and joining the fellows along with Ragnar and others who will be announced this week is really a special award. Now, this award was a fellow award to me and Ragnar were given out in 2020. So I've had a long time to reflect. How did this happen? Reflect on my career. It's been a long journey, I found out when investigating it. And during this time of reflection, I was looking for clues. How did this happen to me? What were the drivers? I want to tell you some stories about that journey. Some backstories, actually, to some of the research and experiences I've had. I grew up outside a small mill town on the shores of Columbia River. I was among a large working class family, most of whom had very little education. My father went only through the 8th grade, for example. My roots are in the country, among the rural working class folks. You see, I grew up with, and to this day still have, the values and preferences of rural working class people that I grew up among. Most of my family didn't place the greater value on common sense than on book learning, as they called it. Common sense is the ability to solve problems in practical ways, as they call it, with the materials and the tools one has on hand. We had a name for that in our context. It's called the baling wire solution. Instead of duct tape, which we didn't have back then. My parents, however, planted the idea at a very young age that I was going to go to college. The schools weren't particularly good in my area, nor was I a very good student. But an incident during my secondary education in high school, I took a summer job at a local mill where a lot of my relatives worked their entire lives. And it gave me the incentive to go to college. I did not want to work in a mill after that experience. I didn't want to punch a clock. I didn't want to take orders from the managers. I was a little bit of an independent guy. So I developed a strong urge to leave my hometown, get an education, and see the world. One fantasy I had at that young age was to jump on a cargo ship and sail to the South Seas. So after high school, I attended the local community college, majoring in mathematics. Math was really the only subject that I felt confident in, that I could do well at. All of the others, I was struggling. Later, I earned a Bachelor's of Science degree at San Francisco State University and met my future wife. After graduating with the degree, Elena and I married and joined the Peace Corps, inspired by President Kennedy. This was our first attempt to make a difference. We spent nearly 2 years in an isolated village in the hills of Taita, not far from Mount Kilimanjaro, across the border, working on a cooperative development program with farmers and their families. After that experience, we had some major realizations. We didn't make a difference in their lives, but they made a difference in ours. We developed a great respect and affection for the farmers, traders, and shopkeepers, the farmers who overcame obstacles to grow crops, raise livestock, and market their produce with a lot of common sense. We also found a great deal of satisfaction living among and working with people of many different cultures from that first experience. It did have a major impact on us and significant benefits that we became quite confident and comfortable working among people in different cultures. It gave us a reason to go forward. So after we returned home, we decided to make a difference, or acquire some skills in order to make a difference. At the time, I hoped to find a job with an international development organization, FAO or some other organization, to return to the field in Africa or elsewhere and do some significant work to make a difference. I chose to study economic development at the University of Washington in Seattle. It was tough, as I wasn't never a really strong student, but and in addition to that, I was drawn into the anti-war and civil rights protests and demonstrations that were going on at that time. Came down to a tough decision I made. That was how to make a difference. Do I protest or do I study? I found out I couldn't do both. I finally decided to cloister myself and just focus on my studies. Then midway through that graduate career, a stroke of luck. A stroke of luck. It's been a pattern throughout my life. A luck where this quest to study economic development was interrupted. About halfway, when Gardner Brown offered me a research assistantship with a new Sea Grant-funded fisheries project. Norfish was an interdisciplinary group of researchers, including fisheries science, economics, biomathematics, computer science, law, and others. And we focused on the study of Northeast Pacific fisheries. This was my first experience with an interdisciplinary project to address a common set of issues. It expanded my lens, my view of life and world, and has had a profound impact on my research and professional work. After receiving my PhD, I accepted a position at the University of Rhode Island, working primarily with another interdisciplinary group of academics on small-scale fisheries development. I thrived in that environment. I liked working with a team of scholars with varying perspectives to address a common set of problems. And I was confident and comfortable working in other countries, such as in Central America, where we had our first project. The leaders of this project Harlan Lampe and Nelson Marshall had what I call silver tongues. And as a result of their persuasive powers, this group was blessed with substantial funding from the federal government. So they were pretty busy doing that, and they pretty much left it up to me to organize team meetings, work products, and integrating the pieces of the work into a unified whole. I drew on the bioeconomic framework for that. It's an amazing, powerful framework to organize your thinking. We first focused on small-scale fisheries development, which was the craze at the time. And here you see some photos from El Salvador, where University of Rhode Island graduate students were collecting data from fish producers, traders, and vendors. The main challenge for me at that time was collecting primary data, something I had to learn on my own. You see, the University of Washington Economics Department, at least at that time, and maybe still, focused on theory. But all the students were told, if you know the theory, you can learn how to apply it. Yeah, that ain't easy, folks. I needed applied economic skills, such as you get at an agricultural economics program or other such applied economics programs. But I was starting to feel that such efforts can make a difference in the lives of fishermen, traders, and vendors, if the goals of the project are fulfilled, which at the time seemed very promising. Again, my lens was broadening, but it was still narrow in the global scheme of things. I knew very little about world fisheries, where we were in the 1970s, and how we got there. Then I had another stroke of luck. While at the University of Rhode Island, I was appointed to an advisory committee of the local regional Fisheries Management Council, where I began to learn about New England fisheries management issues in the region, but I still felt inadequate, since I knew next to nothing about the fisheries in our area, how they came to be, the way they were, etc. To learn about those fisheries, I sought to investigate the history of New England fisheries, which would come to have a major impact on my professional career. You see, in the North Atlantic, on both sides of the Atlantic up north, World War II kind of closed down the fisheries to a large extent. And after the war, the stocks had rebounded because of less fishing pressure. Fishing vessels returned, had been quiet during the war, came back to fishing, and government subsidy programs enhanced fishing capacity. New markets were developed to serve the the greater landings in different species being produced at that time. Also during this period, the International Convention for the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries was formed, and they were set to conduct scientific studies of the fisheries and fish resources, as well as to manage the fisheries. Here you see some of the management measures that they employed at the time, and in our area of New England, the coastal states off which they had jurisdiction. In New England, in the 1970s, is this the right slide? Yeah. A threat from distant water fleets. Large factory trawlers moved into the area on our offshore fishery resources on our banks in this area. And this heavy fishing pressure led to the decline of some very valuable species, including haddock, to some extent the cod as well. During this time, IIFET tried to tighten these restrictions, but it wasn't very effective. Enforcement of their management measures was problematic throughout the IIFET years. These distant water fleets harmed the U.S. domestic fishing industry, and the industry denounced the presence of those fleets. It was one of the few issues that there was uniform agreement on. Get rid of those foreigners. And that uproar led to eventually extending our fisheries jurisdiction out to 200 miles via the Magnuson Fisheries Conservation and Management Act passed in 1976. The new law established fishery management councils in 8 coastal regions of the United States and called for management plans to be established and implemented. The New England Council's initial plan essentially just incorporated the old ICNAF regulations that were in place at the time with total allowable catches, some landing and size limits, closures, etc. And fisheries law enforcement was assigned to federal agencies, including our Coast Guard and Fisheries Service fisheries enforcement offices, and together with the fisheries enforcement programs in individual states, the five states. There were numerous problems with enforcement and lack of compliance. One study by Stanley Wang and Andy Rosenberg concluded in their analysis there were wholesale violations and inadequate enforcement resources to enforce these regulations, these rules. In addition, the data on that short period of time, very inadequate, and really can't be used for any serious analysis. It was smoke and mirrors. Since I was appointed to that committee, my colleague from political science was also on that advisory committee. And Tim Hennessy was an incredibly experienced person. He knew a little bit of economics, but was exposed to a lot of intellectual work by a number of prominent political science researchers. So we got together, put our heads together, and we recalled some of the analytical work that had been done in economics on enforcement and criminal behavior, etc. And we started to just describe what's going on. So we conducted a lot of interviews in Washington among the states, enforcement authorities, etc. And we also sought funding to organize a workshop on fisheries law enforcement. From our research, this descriptive research, we had some key findings. It was the Fishery Management Council that set the management measures. They essentially ignored the enforcement challenges being posed and thought that the enforcement authorities simply enforced the rules that were based on scientific study, and that those authorities had no role in setting the management measures. Tim noted that the way things were decided upon was a classic case of muddling through, where decisions were made in a serial, disjointed, and incremental way. Lindblom's famous muddling through. Then another stroke of luck. In 1981, Peter Anderson decided to spend his sabbatical with me at the University of Rhode Island. We've now worked together and enjoyed friendships for 41 and a half years. We're getting old, folks, but we still push forward. Peter and I pulled together a bioeconomic framework for fisheries law enforcement, combining Gary Becker's framework or model on criminal behavior, and married that to the bioeconomic model. Again, the power of bioeconomics. Gary Becker's model is based upon peer deterrence that I'll explain a little bit in a little bit. So we applied that model and produced some early research on that at the first IIFET meeting 40 years ago, folks, in Anchorage, Alaska in 1982. That appeared in the proceedings following in 1983, and we later published a more complete and revised version in Land Economics in 1985. And the key findings in that analysis was the MEY solution, when you take into account costly, imperfect enforcement, the resulting MEY stocks are small. And associated with that, the fishing effort or mortality greater than if you ignored such costs and conditions. As I said, Tim and I organized a workshop on fisheries law enforcement. We wanted to assemble a diverse set of participants with diverse points of view. We brought in people from industry, fishing producers, government, and researchers. Our group included people from not only the U.S., but Canada, and our lonely guy from Denmark. Among these participants was a group of Canadian researchers who presented research that was very impressive and persuasive. They had conducted surveys of commercial fishermen in Canada, where they estimated illegal gains, expected penalties, perceived penalties, probabilities of detection, and sanctions. And their work had a big impact on those participants. One of the participants, Bill Furlong, took the data and tested Becker's model and was able to show that changes or increase in probabilities of sanctions, detection, conviction, and sanctions, reduced violation rates. It was statistically significant, and he published that in, when was it, 1991. The aftermath of the workshop was quite impressive. It went far beyond my expectations at the time. There were several major actions afterwards. All participants accepted the conventional wisdom of Becker's model. Managers and prosecutors revised penalty schedules, increasing the penalties for notices of violations. Even the administrative law court judge, who would ride the circuit around the country trying fisheries cases, Judge Dolan, started handing down more severe penalties. And enforcement agency heads found these arguments very helpful when they requested added resources, enforcement resources for their programs. There was a great benefit to us at the University of Rhode Island as well, because the enforcement authorities wanted similar studies like the Canadians to be done on fisheries in New England. So we conducted a number of studies in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Our first fishery was the Massachusetts lobster fishery. And the way we worked was we worked with a small group of fishermen who advised us on this whole process, developing a questionnaire and putting questions and descriptions in terms that fishermen relate to. And that advisory group was very helpful, and they were part of the Lobstermen's Association to give us credibility among the fishermen in their organization. And so we conducted the survey, we went back to these advisors, and then finally presented it to the Lobstermen's Association and other interested parties. And in the lobster case, they felt this was really valuable information, and a number of changes were made in the industry, as well as came out of that thinking we were making a difference, a positive difference. But not all is good news. Compliance information we gathered from our survey of the Rhode Island clam fishery created an uproar among the clam producers and traders. They all knew what the violations that were going on, taking clams out of polluted waters, but they didn't want it exposed publicly. We normally published our research at the end, the referee journals and other places to present our results. This was publicly available, funded by public funds. But in the case of the Rhode Island clam fishery, it became a difficult situation. And I ultimately decided not to publicize and publish that information. Did I do the right thing? I don't know. Some general patterns appeared in our data from the surveys of these fisheries. First, generally speaking, there's a very small chance of being detected on any one violation. It's less than 1%. Also, the expected gains fishermen have for fishing illegally were viewed as being quite large. In the groundfish fishery, for example, fishing in closed areas brought in an extra $15,000 at the time on one trip. And the expected fines were small. In the groundfish fishery, the expected fine was between $200 and $400. They viewed it as a cost of doing business. In fact, some of them even had business plans for the year with fines as a line item. So the expected sanction, 1% times that $200 to $400, is far less than the expected illegal gains. And yet, despite all that, the incentives to violate, we found in general, not in all cases, but in many cases, a high degree of compliance. We also found that among groups of fishermen, there tended to be three general types of regulated fishermen. Pardon me, I need a sip. On one end, there were the bad guys, the chronic, frequent violators. They were driven primarily by financial considerations, and they would violate almost every opportunity, reasonable opportunity. And it tends to be a fairly small group, a good number. Things are going well if you got around 5% or less than 10%. But in some fisheries, it creeps up to about 20%. It depends on the fishery. Then at the other end, you have these dedicated compliers, driven primarily by moral obligations, doing the right thing. And they rarely, if ever, violate if rules are perceived to be legitimate. Then in between, you have what we call formally conditional compliers. It's a pretty large group. I call them the fickle middle because they jump around. They're driven by a mix of financial, normative, and situational factors in making compliance decisions. And we found that across these fisheries, this group had an enormous variation in the degree of which they complied. This model we produced involved peer deterrence, like the paper Peter and I developed and that others were going by at the time. And it has a number of serious shortcomings in my view. First of all, it doesn't explain the evidence very well. Hey, what about all those compliers where the economic incentives are to violate? And it also has impractical policy prescriptions. It says to increase the fines, increase deterrence, increase detection, more enforcement resources, higher fines. But these low expected penalties that were in place do not result in high violation rates. And it's policy prescriptions, more enforcement resources, very, very high fines, are simply impractical. Legislators are not willing to spend that amount of money for a lot of enforcement resources, and the laws themselves and the courts often restrict the extent to which fishermen are fined. So we had a puzzle. Why are fishermen complying when illegal gains exceed the expected penalties? And this group of lobstermen that we worked with, we were out there interviewing them after our survey, and we told them this situation, and I said, why are so many of you violating? You can make a lot more money if you go against the rules. We were told that they believe in the regulations, that complying is the right thing to do. They were indicating a sense of moral obligation. They also, particularly in the lobster fishery, there was a high degree of self-enforcement. There were numerous stories up and down the New England coast of fistfights among lobstermen, where the lobstermen take it upon themselves to go to a violator and insist that he stop stealing from their traps or scrubbing big buried lobsters and the like. And they would often get up with some fighting. There were even a few cases of burning their boats. It's not necessarily the best thing to do, but they were happening. So we decided to look into this moral obligation stuff. And we reviewed the economics literature. And lo and behold, the father of economics, Adam Smith, published the book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, some almost 10 years before his famous work, The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, he characterized individuals as being motivated by acting morally, seeking the approval of others, as well as enhancing wealth. And he had this metaphor, image of an impartial spectator in each one of us to judge us, scrutinize the propriety of one's own conduct, to put it in his words. We also reviewed more contemporary literature and found that a number of contemporary economists have treated morality, and in various ways, some of whom have earned Nobel laureates, not on their work, but for other purposes. And yet, many economists proclaim that economics has nothing to do with morality. And that reminds me of a story. In 1992, at the European Association of Fisheries Economists meeting in Salerno, Italy, organized by the late Massimo Spagnolo, I presented a paper called Morality and Fairness and Their Role in Fisheries Regulation. Now, Massimo had invited the local TV news station to cover the conference, and they asked to speak to the author of this paper on morality and fairness. But Massimo's staff couldn't find me. So they tagged Ragnvaldr Hannesson to interview.
I love this story.
And Ragnvaldr told them, and from what I heard, it's third hand Ragnvaldr, that economics has nothing to do with morality. So Ragnvaldr, I want to thank you for denying me the chance to be the star on the local Salerno TV news that night. What are you going to do? Well, although we knew that morality was important, we didn't know how to measure it. So during, I guess, late 80s, early 90s, I was attending the study of the Law and Society Association meetings. And one day on a plane ride to somewhere in the U.S., my seatmate was a Quaker minister. So we got to talking, and I said, "Tell me about morality." And he was interested in my research, and we were talking, and I said, "We're stuck. We don't know how to measure it." He said, "Well, you ought to look at the literature by Larry Lawrence Kohlberg." Okay. So I went home and talked to my wife, who is a PhD psychologist. I said, "Do you know anything about this Kohlberg guy?" And she said, "John, he's famous. He's famous." And she pulled out some books, showed me where he was cited, and his work was built on by other social scientists. And it turned out that Kohlberg had a survey instrument for measuring moral development of individuals. He essentially extended Piaget's work on children to older young people. Luck again. On a plane, seatmate. We next turn to sociology. And we found two approaches in there, one very similar to the economic deterrence approach, instrumental, in which compliance depends upon incentives, and then normative. And as I said, I was attending meetings of the Law and Society Association organization at that time, and I was presenting a paper on our compliance work, and someone in the audience commented that I had to look at the work by Tom Tyler. And it was particularly useful to us because he too provided us with an instrument for measuring the perception of fairness and appropriateness of the law and implementing agencies. In other words, legitimacy. So we began to pull all these elements together. We developed what we call an enriched theory of regulatory compliance that we published in 1998. And this model integrates economic theory with theories from psychology and sociology, accounting for both tangible and intangible motivations influencing individuals' decisions, compliance decisions. Turns out that this theory is applicable to a number of institutional situations. I'm surprised at the diversity of citations of this article across all sorts of fields. And it also provides a means by which to design and implement more efficient and effective compliance and regulatory programs. And it sets up a number of testable hypotheses. My PhD student at the time, Kay Kupran, held a position on the economics faculty at the University of Britannia, Malaysia, outside of Kuala Lumpur. He really functioned as an equal partner on this journey. Well-read, thoughtful, inquisitive, and with a very mature and broad worldview. We remain close to this day. Kupran took up the challenge of conducting compliance interviews in Malaysia. It took us 5 months to develop the survey questionnaire. From my Peace Corps experience, I knew that the survey instrument had to be culturally sensitive, designed to connect to the lives of those trawler fishermen on both coasts of Malaysia. We worked with fishermen's associations and had conducted over 300 interviews of trawler fishermen, focusing on a fishing zone regulation that was in place at the time which restricted vessels from fishing in different parts of the coastal waters. Here you see some interviews being done on the top photo by one of his students, and down below the local fisheries enforcement people inspecting these trawlers. We tested the model first on the Malaysian fisheries, and then the model or variations of this model were later tested in other countries, such as those shown here by other researchers in our field. And there's been additional evidence since this point in time along these lines on tax compliance, and a number of experiments being done on some of these influences on determining compliance. The results from the formal tests of the model, in my view, and I may be wrong, provide strong supports for a number of factors in determining compliance, the number of fishermen complying as well as the extent of violations. But in this formal analysis, there were mixed, inconsistent support for the legitimacy organizational of legitimacy. Now, since then, Tom Tyler has extended his work. He's got a more sophisticated model now, and his survey estimates and other approaches to collecting this data. And in his 2003 paper presents stronger and very convincing evidence that legitimacy is an important part of that, and it's the fairness of the processes that matter. We also found that through his work, this notion of moral obligation is due to the legitimacy of the rules, individuals' perceptions of beliefs and values. Social influence, as we've given some examples, can be strong and prevalent, and yet most compliance is voluntary, based upon common understandings, procedures for developing and implementing those, and perceived to be effective. There are times when we tend not to obey the speed limit, and it's not really important. That's what I think of. So there are a number of necessary conditions for success. Fishermen's support is key. The evidence on that is very strong and pervasive, and voluntary compliance results from these moral and social considerations, and it's also the least cost form of compliance. And yet our management compliance programs neglect it too much. So it became evident to me that in order to make a difference, we needed to communicate with non-economists, non-technical folks, policymakers, interested parties, etc. So how are we going to explain this stuff to them? So I started using cartoons. At the time, back in 1996, I was on sabbatical working at the Ministry of Fisheries in New Zealand. And I was given some projects to work on. And I realized then that I needed to move out of my economist academic mode and find a way to communicate. So I started using cartoons to demonstrate some of the principles here. Here's a case of a so-called fisherman making the decision whether to comply or not. And Becker's pure deterrence model, with our findings of large illegal gains compared to the expected penalty, would tend to drive fishermen to violate. And to counter that, you had to increase enforcement resources and penalties so that the expected penalty was greater in order to generate compliance. When we add the enriched model to this, the forces of social influence and moral obligation, you can still have small expected penalty, if the combined with moral obligation and social influences are large enough to induce fishermen to comply. Unfortunately, those conditions don't exist very often. Moral obligation is often absent in our fisheries, such as we found in the groundfish fishery, and the social influence can be on the other side. We found that crew wouldn't agree to fish on a captain's boat unless he agreed in advance to fish in closed areas where they would earn more income. We also wanted to present our policy prescriptions in a package, so to speak. And I came up with the idea of a smart compliance policy. And that's best articulated in a 2010 paper by Dennis King and myself, where we did some further empirical work on New England fisheries, where we lay out this package. Okay? It has several essential elements that are listed here. And I've worked with some fisheries enforcement, now called compliance agencies, to implement some of these ways, some of these principles. But it's not easy, it's really tough. I credit the work in New Zealand and Australia for making progress on the practical implementation. See, a lot of these things aren't easy to measure. I worked on that, and I tell you, it's tough. But they've come up with ways to overcome that. Not perfect, but they're operational. I haven't kept up to date on the status of compliance programs and whether they're following these principles or not, other than to observe in the United States they're not doing it. And the Conservation Law Foundation in Boston recently did a study on New England fisheries management and embraced this smart compliance approach and found that the current system is seriously lacking. We continue to have a number of challenges in our fisheries compliance work, and there's an enormous amount of work to be done on this. I challenge you to rise to this challenge and do this research. I can't do it anymore. I'm 80 years old, folks. In my closing remarks, I found out that the principal driver throughout my career was to make a difference. I also had a strong amount of curiosity. I was into exploring and taking risks. I encountered a lot of failure, but I learned from those failures. They're the best teachers we have. Take them on. Learn from them. Listening and learning from others, the Quaker minister on a plane, a sociologist at a multidisciplinary conference. Those are valuable perspectives. Read in other areas. Don't confine yourself to the textbooks of economics or specialty studies. Broaden your worldview. I also had a high degree of naivete. I didn't let that stop me. I exposed it. I asked questions. You might think, well, those are stupid, silly questions. But hey, what are you going to do? A little bit of embarrassment can overcome your naivete. Broaden your view of the world. I benefited from a lot of mentors over the years. I would approach them, or they would approach me, surprisingly. And I thoroughly enjoyed mentoring throughout my career. And even to this day, I find myself doing that. And lastly, I want to promote the bioeconomics framework. It's a very powerful framework, just for organizing your thoughts. You know, ecologists, the natural science of, say, marine resources or marine ecology, ecosystems, has a really complex interaction diagram up there of all the interactions between the species, predators, prey, and so forth. Well, connected to that is a similarly complex ecology of the human dimensions. Think along those lines, all the things that are going on that affect the outcomes. You can pull it all together, which is thinking along bioeconomic lines. I want to acknowledge a number of people in my life. Here I show people who have made a big difference in working with me as colleagues and co-authors, and then some great students over the years. They taught me a lot. And they played a very significant role in my research program and just my life in general. But in addition to the people are listed here, I want to acknowledge my family. My wife Elena and daughters Erica and Christina, who are here, made a lot of sacrifices during my career when I was often traveling away for weeks, sometimes months at a time. But they also kept me grounded. Erica and Christina would play in my office after school. And they would often leave me notes and drawings and all that. I'll never forget one note. Keep me grounded. Papa, don't just think about fish. Also, I want to recognize the role my parents, grandparents, and others in my family did to shape my life and career. My dad taught me to listen to others, learn and explore. My mother introduced me to books about the greater world and to dream about experiencing that world. And my grandmother, oh, we love our grandmothers, I did mine. In her youth, she was a cook on ranches, cooking for tens of ranch hands every day, at least 2 meals a day. She had the ability to handle horses and men at the same aplomb. And she modeled for me how to be firm, kind, and good-natured. This journey has been wonderful, and this opportunity to reflect on it also rewarding. And I can say that this country boy lives on happily ever after. Thank you so much. Have a great time.